Hi, the following audio is a translation of the podcast Palabras Mayores Colombia with historian Daniel Trejos. Enjoy. Conquest of America. The story that they usually tell us is from the myths, because from there we have constructed our identities, principally the national identities from myths, through legends, because this is how they constructed Hispanic America in the 19th century and also the 18th century. We are seeing that with the identity, for example, of the criollos, and this is something very important to understand from where they are constructing the discourse. The criollos, you've got to understand them as a class. When they speak of Simón Bolívar, there has been a lot of differing information published about him. Tons of myths and legends. Or when they speak in general about the liberators, San Martín, O'Higgins, including Iturbide. You've got to understand them not as the individual Simón Bolívar, but to the class that they belong to, the criolla class, the dissatisfied, and everything that shapes the unique character of the criollos. So from there, we are able to understand the underlying cause of things. When we see who built not only the liberators, but also the founding fathers, the different founding fathers of Hispanic America, how they built the discourse, we are going to be able to understand the myths from different perspectives. The thing is that Spain also creates its foundational myths. Spain creates its national narratives as well. And much of this narrative is transmitted to us by these means. For example, at the end of the day, what Santiago Mesilla in Spain is aiming to do is rebuild a national identity in support of a political project. So when the discourse arrives to us, it is a discourse made specifically for Spain. And therefore, when they come across the criolla narratives, let's say in quotes, the narratives of Hispanic America, they're going to find many conflicting parts, because there is a lot of conflict. Because in this case, they are not simply searching for a truth, but rather reconstructing a foundational myth. When we speak of Hispanic America, we tend to confuse many of the terms. For example, that is where I put the emphasis that the devil is in the details. Colony, conquest, viceroys. There are many terms that people generally do not know, or simply search quickly in Google and say, oh, look, this colony existed under a pact between the metropolis and the colony, where the resources were extracted to benefit the metropolis. Okay, I'm good with that. The problem is that the concept of colony is not understood the same way when the conquistadors are arriving. They are coming from Spain. They are heirs. Their grandfathers participated in the Spanish reconquest against Muslim rule. They hold a frontier mindset. They have gone advancing the Christian kingdoms. They push forward and establish a settlement, what we would call a colony, a town. Later they advanced more of the border, settling once again until the border arrives to cover the entire peninsula, and they expel the Muslim rule. That is the mentality that they had when they arrived to the Americas. Precisely that. The type of warfare that applies alliances in some cases, massacres in others, domination in some cases, while also maintaining cordial relationships in other circumstances. For example, we see the way they wage war against the Mexica Empire, when they lay siege to Mexico, Tenochtitlan. It's a type of war very different from that. It's a very different type of war from the one they wage against the Purepecha, the Tarascans, which is the empire bordering the Mexica Empire to the northwest. They basically ally themselves because the Tarascans offer up their kingdom after seeing what happened to their enemy's kingdom, a dead enemy. So they decide not to fight. So, Within the same process, within the same territory, we find different types of conquest. And so, when we talk about conquest, we often tend to stick to just one of these narratives, either telling one type or going completely with the other. And what Spanish nationalism sometimes does is focus precisely on those types of stories. Look how well we treated the Tlaxcalans, how well we treated the Tarascans, the alliances that were made, how kind we were. And they leave out the other side, how other peoples were dominated, such as the Mayan regions. For example, the conquest of Guatemala, which was very violent. They don't mention the 6 bloody battles they fought against the same Tlaxcalans, even though they were supposed to be allies later on. But then, we also find a narrative in Hispanic America that is very influenced by a 20th century wave, a fairly mestizo nationalism that recovers the indigenous narratives that historians have worked on as a, quote, history from below, that usually tries to recover the story from the perspective of the peoples who were conquered. But it has also been often misunderstood, in part due to our own ability as historians to communicate it properly, which leads to narratives that, on the contrary, speak only of the violent processes of conquest, without understanding that it is truly a mixture. Latin Americans, well, this also includes Brazilians and others, are heirs to very complex, very violent processes, but at the same time of construction not only of identity, but also of civilization, which ultimately made us who we are. Another thing we have to be very careful about is when we say we. They conquered us, right? They mistreated us. They robbed us, because in the end, the very same conquerors who came to America are our ancestors, right? The ancestors of the Spaniards stayed over there. They never came. The ones who came to America, the conquerors, are our ancestors, just like the indigenous peoples are. So in the end, Americans are heirs of both the conquerors and the conquered. Of extremely violent processes, yes, but also of processes that gave rise to civilization. So, for example, in the same narrative of the Spaniards, of Spanish nationalism, there is another side. We conquered them. No, you didn't conquer anything. You, Spain today, are not the Spanish Empire, and you and your ancestors stayed on the peninsula. The conquerors were the ones who came here. So these kinds of details are what ultimately shape these macro narratives, which in some cases end up, so to speak, in deadly contradictions, where the national narrative emerging from Spain and the national narrative that exists in some Latin American countries are absolutely contradictory, and often neither of them come from historical truths. It's often said that Spain didn't really have colonies, that what it had were viceroyalties instead, and that the Spanish Empire was incredibly benevolent compared to other empires, especially when compared to the colonization of the United States by England. But how much truth is there to that? We would have to talk about different periods, because the initial period is not the same. We usually divide it into conquest and colony, right? But we also have to be very careful, because we're actually talking about different types of colonial phases. We're talking first about the period of conquest, the advance into the land. Then they begin to establish settlements. So when we read some of the laws from the period being written for the Americas, they speak of pueblos, villas, and colonias. In that sense, they're referring to settlements, the manner of settling. What happens later is that we come to understand colony as the colonial pact, as this system of extraction where a metropolis extracts resources from its colonies. With the change from the Habsburgs, we're roughly talking from early 1500s to the late 1500s. That is the period of conquest. Then there's a much more structured period, with significant advancement and investment. And often, it's not even investment from the metropolis, but investment from the viceroyalties themselves. This is the period between 1600 and 1700, the Habsburg period. Then there is something called the War of Spanish Succession. The last Habsburg dies without an heir, and a war breaks out in Europe to determine who will take the Spanish throne, and, by extension, who will control the American territories. In the end, a Bourbon from the French Bourbon house assumes the Spanish throne. With that comes a French administrative mentality. They impose something called intendants, which France used in its colonies. Now we can talk properly about colonies, because there was a centralized state, what's known as enlightened despotism, or Bourbon centralism. And with this, many reforms are implemented in the Americas over the course of about 60 to 70 years. The most important ones. In practice, even though they were still called viceroyalties, a true colonial regime is imposed. For example, the viceroyalty of New Spain was subjected to very heavy taxes. The crown also controlled certain raw material production, like mercury. It sold it at nearly 300% of its value to the miners who extracted gold and silver. Enormous demands were also placed on the other viceroyalties. The regions of America were deindustrialized in order to industrialize the Iberian Peninsula. Essentially, America was required to send raw materials to Spain to be processed in Spanish industries and then returned to America. However, Spain could not handle all the consumption of the finished goods demanded by America, nor could it absorb all the raw material production coming from America. So in the end, this created an imbalance, essentially turning the territories into colonies. So yes, we can talk about colonies, but we have to be very careful about which specific period of the 300-year-long empire we are referring to. And it's not contradictory to speak of viceroyalties and colonies at the same time. Great Britain, for example, had a British viceroy in India and did not call it a colony. It was called the British Raj, and it was a colony. So we must be careful when saying they were not viceroyalties, they were colonies. Well, the institutional structure and the way which resource extraction or exploitation was imposed are not mutually exclusive. According to Enrique Floriscano, a Spanish historian, the Bourbon period was a kind of colonial regime. It carried forward the development that had taken place in earlier centuries, but the actual administration and logic of the Bourbons treated America as a colony. One may ask, and did we have a genocide during the conquest of the Americas or not? I wouldn't speak of genocide for a very important reason, and that is that the word genocide requires a specific notion. Genocide is geno, right? Meaning people, ethnic group, and side means the intention to eliminate. I wouldn't speak of genocide precisely because the notion of people, pueblo, as a sovereign entity carrying within it a political project does not emerge until the French Revolution. Before that, pueblo was understood more like how we sometimes understand it in Hispanic America and also in Spain, as in the town I come from, right? We talk about pueblos de indios, Indian towns, not los indios, indigenous people as a singular people, but rather each specific town, each, let's say, structure where there is a cabildo, local council, and the life of a specific community is organized. With the French Revolution, the people start to be seen as sovereign, and now the people hold their own political project. And that political project only has legitimacy through the people. This idea of people, combined with the development of nations, where now the people demand a nation, meaning a state, and also joined with the social Darwinism that was taking shape in Europe, starts to create divisions where people and race become increasingly inseparable. So now we begin to see these projects of defining who is part of my people or my nation. And by creating the boundaries of who belongs to my people and my nation, I also define who does not belong. And in doing so, I create the other. And by creating the other and seeking the purity of my own group, what I seek is the extermination of that other. That is the notion of genocide. And the idea of genocide at the time, in the 16th century, the period of conquest, I believe we cannot speak of genocide because there was neither the intention nor the conceptualization of indigenous people as a people. But this has also led to two opposing discourses. One that denies the massacres, denies the demographic collapse, and also denies certain processes of extermination, such as the use of war as a tool to eliminate those who resisted. For example, we do have cases of entire communities being wiped out, so I would be very careful about using the word genocide in the ancient world or early modern period, precisely for that reason. But this doesn't mean denying that over 90% of the indigenous population perished. And even if there wasn't an intentional plan, for instance, during the reducciones, forced resettlements in indigenous towns, or during the missionary efforts, we understand today that if you crowd a population together and there is a disease, it's going to spread much faster among a group that had no immunity, and that they would die from a common cold, from measles, or from many diseases brought by Europeans. Today, we understand that. Epidemiological studies in the 19th century advanced greatly. Germs were the decisive factor in the conquest and in the demographic collapse that befell indigenous peoples.